Nietzsche well understood those processes that have been called defense mechanisms by Freud, particularly sublimation, repression, and the turning of instincts towards oneself. Both give a new expression to Diderot's old assumption that modern man is afflicted with a peculiar illness bound up with civilization, because of civilization demands of man that he renounce the gratification of his instincts. Now, so for Freud and for Nietzsche, they both adopted a perspective that was different from that of Piaget. And I think Piaget is actually correct. For Freud, the individual is striving upwards to manifest their true nature, which is in some ways can be quite brutish. And what the superego is doing, what society is doing, is actually inhibiting it. It's stopping it from happening. So it's basically, it's as if society puts each individual into a jail cell of sorts and only allows them to do certain things within that cell. Now, you can certainly understand that, and I think that is true the more tyrannical a society becomes, and as Ellen Berger pointed out, Victorian society was quite authoritarian. And the more authoritarian a society, the more there is a struggle between the individual attempting to be an individual and the culture attempting to turn them into an absolutely predictable cog in a machine. But, you know, so Freud, of course, viewed the primary conflicts in mental life as the ego, tortured by the id in some sense, right, being driven by underlying biological forces, but also severely inhibited and repressed by the superego. You know, it's a perfectly persuasive model, and there are situations under which it's more applicable. But Piaget's idea that the fundamental conflict within people isn't necessarily social versus the individual. For Piaget, the fundamental conflict was between motivational systems and then between their expression across time within the individual and then between their expression across time within the individual in relationship to all other individuals and to society. So it was more like a complex problem that could be solved by a civilized game than it was a massive force, that being the superego, crushing the individual into submission. Now, you might say that for neurotic people, and neurotic is a strange word, but we'll say for the sake of argument right now that a neurotic person who is suffering sufficiently from the conditions of their life for psychological reasons, that their life is not bearable in its current form. They're suffering enough to interfere with their own movement forward. What Freud says about the ego versus the superego might well be true in the case of people who aren't well adapted. Because they haven't been able to organize their own motivational drives in a stable manner within themselves, and then they haven't been socialized effectively so that they can fit into the broader community like a dancer might in a complex dance, then they're much more likely to experience the social world versus them, especially if they're rejected and they can't gratify any of their fundamental needs because of their inability or their awkwardness. So I would say, to the degree that you're suffering from failure, so to speak, for one reason or another, you're much more likely to see the social rules as a harsh and repressive superego. Obviously, they're not doing you any good. I would say that's probably more likely to happen if you're somewhat near the bottom of a given dominance hierarchy. And that also means, if you're at the bottom of a given dominance hierarchy, that you're much more likely to consider the spirit of the structure as an authoritarian spirit and a repressive spirit, because obviously it isn't making room for you. And sometimes, of course, that's the case. You know, I mean, there's lots of societies where everyone at the bottom has nothing, and only the people at the top have something. You know, and it's hard to see how you could not view the culture / superego as something that was harsh and repressive and authoritarian and crushing under those circumstances. So